We have been doing a series of programs about some mysterious biblical prophecies called the horsemen of the apocalypse, and we have now come to the fourth and final program in our series on the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We've already been through the destructive effect of the previous three, white, red, and black, and the untold suffering they represent for all of humankind. But did you know this final horse is even more devastating than all the others combined? In a moment, we're going to take a look at the global import of that fourth horse of the apocalypse, the pale horse of disease. And it's an awful lot more ominous, believe it or not, than all those other methods that you might have seen vicariously of watching humans die. Over the entire course of history, disease has been man's greatest enemy in terms of sheer loss of life. And that's an incredible statement. I'm sure you'd never heard it before, but it happens to be true. Most people would think warfare has been, or natural calamities or the like. But according to a leading Swedish pathologist, infectious diseases have probably been the most dangerous enemies of mankind, much more so than war and mass murder. And Hans Zinzer, in his book called Rats, Lice, and History, likewise explained, swords and lances, arrows, machine guns, and even high explosives have had far less power over the fates of nations than the typhus louse, the plague flea, and the yellow fever mosquito. Even today, in the age of miracle drugs and space-age medicine, the toll that pestilence takes is staggering by anybody's standards. Last year, 1 million people around the world succumbed to tuberculosis. Malaria claims another 1 million lives in Africa alone. There's a painful, debilitating disease called bilharzia that is snail-borne that afflicts about 250 million so-called third world, the have-not, underdeveloped nations' inhabitants. In many of the poorer parts of the world, disease is a way of life. So many people have some horrible disease or other, it's so commonplace. Some 34 million Brazilians, 35% of the population, are hobbled with a host of maladies, including goiter, yaws, tuberculosis, and leprosy. 1/4 of black Africa is under the continual threat of sleeping sickness. In other parts of the continent, up to 20% of the adult population has been reduced to a groping, stumbling existence because of the ravages of a tiny, blood-sucking black fly, carrier of that dreaded river blindness disease. Today, in our Western world of clinics, hospitals, doctors, vaccination, and wonder drugs, we like to think that we're immune, that we're totally free from infectious disease. But infectious disease is neither a respecter of men nor nations. No part of this world, no matter how modern or up-to-date, is immune. For example, in the United States, malaria has cropped up in California, Alabama, and Texas in the last few years. A few cases, but it's there. Tuberculosis is widespread among Latins and Asians in Los Angeles County. And a strain of typhoid fever currently resistant to antibiotics is being imported into the United States by illegal aliens from Mexico. Bubonic plague is still alive and flourishing in many parts of Western America. We have heard about the ground squirrels of California, and once in a while you hear of an outbreak or 1 or 2 people contracting it. This year, a 3-year-old, who apparently a girl who had come in contact with a plague-carrying animal, died from bubonic plague in the Tahoe region of California. 4 campgrounds had to be closed as a result of the scare. Also, the Legionnaires' deaths we read of in Philadelphia in 1976 is an example of how suddenly lethal maladies, sometimes untraceable, and sometimes they don't even know what to call them, but they can strike nevertheless. Pestilential pandemics have shown little respect for human life. Even during the last few decades of history, in 1957, again in 1968, when the Hong Kong flu swept around the world, taking tens of thousands of lives, recent disease epidemics have also caused massive dislocations and panic and uproars, political upheavals. In 1974, a meningitis outbreak in Sao Paulo, Brazil, took some 2,000 lives. Residents of that city fled by the thousands. Neighboring Uruguay was so concerned she closed down the border as a precautionary measure. measure, sort of a national quarantine. Smallpox, a disease that was almost ready to be relegated to the pages of history along with some of the other ancient plagues, is still alive and well, if that's a way to put it, in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan during the 1960s and the 1970s. William E. Small, then editor of Biomedical News, the author of the book titled Third Pollution, had this to say, and I quote, "That many diseases are under control at the moment does not mean that public health efforts can be relaxed. Typhoid, cholera, yellow fever, summer diarrhea, dysentery, tuberculosis, anthrax, intestinal worms, these are still with us and could again return as the plagues of old." The communicable disease problem is further being complicated by the potential hazards brought about by our jet-age transport. No longer do nations live in relative isolation the way they used to, separated by vast oceans and mountain ranges where it takes days or weeks or even months to traverse. Today, a person could come from the Mato Grosso in Brazil to the suburbs of New York City in hours, and nobody be the wiser. Since the incubation period of such disease usually might amount to several days, a potential carrier could clear customs, the health authorities, and the like, and easily be giving hundreds of other people the disease before any telltale symptoms could even break out. Just how susceptible, then, is the human race in this space age to massive disease epidemics? Will that mysterious prophecy of the pale horseman of Revelation 6 ride with renewed vengeance and fury in the modern age? Will mankind ever be engulfed in a massive tidal wave of disease epidemics that would rival the worst ones in all of history? Or have we seen the last of that grim reaper of disease? Before answering that question, let's examine the role disease has played in history and the key factors that led to some of the major epidemics of our past civilization.
Plain Truth, the international publication of understanding. Plain Truth, information you need in today's changing society. Plain Truth. Correspondents in all quarters of the globe report on current trends. For your free sample copy of the monthly Plain Truth magazine, call toll-free 800-423-4444. That's 800-423-4444.
Let me send you your free copy of this magazine, The Plain Truth, that goes behind the meaning of these unbelievable world events and shows you what they really mean. And incidentally, there is good news in this magazine because it does say that we're not going to see humankind perish from this earth. It's no doomsday magazine at all, and that's not what this program is all about. The number is 800-423-4444. In California, Alaska, and Hawaii, it's area 213-577-5225. Well, since the dawn of history, disease has played a pivotal role in the rise and falls of nations, empires, and even mighty civilizations. Even the great empires of old were powerless against onslaught of virulent disease. The plague of Athens that struck in 430 BC contributed heavily to the fall of that ancient city-state. The Roman Empire also had its share of pestilential woes. During the 1st century BC, a severe attack of malaria resulted in a drastic drop in the native birth rate. The plague of Galen in AD 166 further sapped the strength of that empire. Diseases, rather than superior numbers or generalship, often decided the outcome of many a battle. The Spanish used smallpox as their #1 ally, in one sense, in the conquest of Mexico, because the arrival of Cortez in the 1500s touched off an epidemic among the Indians that wiped out almost half of their population. The brilliant military strategist Napoleon came to grief on several occasions because of unexpected epidemics. His biggest defeat came during that Russian campaign when out of a central task force of 265,000 men, only 90,000 of them ever got to Moscow, and most of those were casualties as a result of an outbreak of typhus, not Russian bullets. But by far and away the most devastating disease ever to hit the human race was the Black Plague. It was the greatest of all pandemics and was perhaps the worst single disaster the world ever experienced. Conditions were ripe for that epidemic during the 1300s because cities were crammed with people seeking a good life, security, and the like. Buildings 6 stories high were common, lining streets so narrow that 2 ponies had difficulty establishing a right-of-way. The sewers looked like something out of a nightmare of some of the Mideast nations of today. A shallow ditch running along narrow roadways, clogged with refuse and human and animal offal alike. Bathing during that period, if not unheard of, was looked upon actually with suspicion. Filth and dirt permeated every aspect of man's environment. There were other factors that also played a part in promoting the pandemic. For several years preceding the Black Plague, Europeans had experienced a succession of disastrous crop failures, of malnutrition and starvation. The plague had its origin in infested animals inhabiting the hinterlands of Central Asia. It spread to the shores of the Black Sea, and from there to Italy, via traveled Mediterranean sea lanes. It systematically marched northward until no part of Europe was left unscathed. It completely terrorized and demoralized the populace of Europe. People fled from an infected city thinking they would escape the ravages of the disease, and that only hastened its spread because they already had contracted it and spread it to other people. Dead bodies were wherever they fell, wherever they lay. They littered the fields and accumulated in the streets. They were picked up and piled like cordwood in carts and unceremoniously dumped in mass burial sites. Raw figures, when you talk about hundreds of thousands or millions, don't really convey the stunning devastation of such a thing. 25 million people died in Europe. 13 million died in China. 200,000 towns in Europe and all over were left completely depopulated. Some cities in Italy lost 60% of their inhabitants. Only 1/3 of the people in Norway managed to live through that plague. Moscow lost 127,000 people, Venice 300,000. Towns of 20,000 were reduced down to 2,000. All told, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the people of all of Europe died. Now, this biblical prophecy that talks about 1/3 of a population being wiped out by nuclear warfare, another third by disease, is not then all that futuristic. There have been unbelievable calamities in the past that have obliterated whole percentages, sometimes the broad majority of the populations of whole nations. After all, that Black Death, or the bubonic plague that ran amok during that age in the 13th century, was as much like one of these incredible horsemen of the apocalypse as anything we're talking about in the future, because the Bible does talk about vast percentages of whole nations that can fall victim to yet future plagues. During the last 70 years, modern man has unraveled a lot of mysteries. The secret of the atom, probed the depths of outer space, the depths of the ocean. We've even put men on the moon. Surely no major disease epidemic could ever erupt in our day. Well, maybe we ought to take a look at that flu epidemic that historians and public officials alike rate as the most devastating disease outbreak to strike the world since the Black Death. And that happened in our modern 20th century. That was called the Plague of the Spanish Lady. And as in the days of the Black Plague, this particular flu bug found easy going among a populace weakened by the rigors of that great war, World War I. Aided by modern means of transportation, that influenza bug traveled with incredible rapidity. Virtually no part of the globe, however remote, could escape its lethal impact. At the height of the epidemic, 100 people a day were dying in New York. Theaters, restaurants, schools were closed across the United States. Citizens in various cities were even required at that time to wear protective face masks like they do in Tokyo today. Many were rendered virtual cripples, wheezing and gasping for breath. An estimated 1/3 of the survivors were subsequently subjected to attacks of nephritis, of pulmonary tuberculosis, cardiac disorders because of their weakened condition. Before it was over, 1 billion people. That was half of the world's population. 1 billion people came down with that disease. 20 million people died, including 540,000 Americans. In roughly half a year, it killed twice the number that died during all of World War I. Since the days of World War I, the pattern of disease in the Western world has taken a radically different turn. With the development of the vaccines, penicillin, streptomycin, and sulfa drugs, and other antibiotics, many infectious maladies no longer pose the threat they once did. Better living conditions, shorter working hours, and increased knowledge about health and sanitation have also played a vital part in that process. But as the incidence of infectious illness dropped, there came an almost corresponding rate in the rise of major degenerative disease like cancer, cardiovascular disorders, and chronic respiratory ailments. The number of walking wounded, people cursed with some so-called civilized disease, grows every year as we pay the penalties of a synthetic, artificial, sated lifestyle. In our country, in the United States alone, over 28 million Americans are afflicted with some form of serious debility like blood vessel heart disease. Almost 4 million have suffered from coronary attacks. 1 in 6 Americans and Canadians is afflicted by hypertension. 40 million are pain in varying degrees by arthritis. 4 million by diabetes. Another 5 million who are potential candidates for insulin injections. Every year, more Americans die from cancer than were killed during the entire course of World War II. 1 million are currently under treatment for various malignancies. Another 49 million, roughly 1 out of every 4, will eventually contract this degenerative disease. According to Louis Herber, who is a leading expert on modern environmental problems, what this means in effect is that if it weren't for the extraordinary medical advances and great improvements in the material conditions of life, today's adult might well have a much shorter lifespan than his grandparents did. Herber went on to say, it suggests that modern man would find it very difficult to survive outside a medical and pharmaceutical hothouse. Frederick F. Cartwright, author of Disease and History, likewise made a rather ominous-sounding statement when he said, man must come to terms with himself. If he does not learn self-discipline, if he fails to solve the problems which he has created, then at least temporarily those problems will be solved for him. The solution will lie in the hands of one or all of his age-old enemies, famine, pestilence, and war, the horsemen of the apocalypse. Shocking words for people living in this modern, space-age, civilized Western world. These things are here now. The greater potential for them is here now. Well, we've always had disease, people can say. We've always had disorder. But does that mean then that these prophecies of the Bible will not happen? That these prophecies of Revelation 6 speak only of ongoing, routine, cyclical trouble? Or does it really refer, this pale horse of disease, to something far more ominous?
Because of the size and scope of a topic such as the pale horse of disease, the following booklet is offered. For your free copy of The Pale Horse, call this toll-free number, 800-423-4444. Or you may write Garner, Ted Armstrong, Pasadena, California, 91123. This complimentary booklet is available so that you may examine the source material of this program in greater detail. That phone number once again is 800-423-4444, toll free. Or you may write Garner, Ted Armstrong, Pasadena, California, 91123.
In spite of the rather gruesome title and the picture on the cover of this brief booklet, it is graphically illustrated in full color that you can have free of charge. Believe it or not, there is good news to be read toward the end of this booklet about what will happen eventually, and that humankind will not be obliterated from the causes of these mysterious horsemen of the apocalypse. If you'll dial 800-423-4444, or in California, Alaska, and Hawaii area, 213-577-5225, we'll get it on its way to you absolutely free of charge. Well, it just so happens to be that we have already seen some of the most gruesome plagues in all of history, but we need now to ask about what happens from here. What about the future? We've looked at all of this in history. We've seen a little bit about the bubonic plague, but unfortunately, the pale horse, the last of those 4, has yet to come in biblical prophecy. So let's take a look at some of the background forces that are setting the stage for that future event. As in the days of the Industrial Revolution, a tidal wave of rural dwellers is now almost lemming-like descending upon major metropolitan areas of the world. And most of the migrants are heading for urban centers known as these super cities that oftentimes can sprawl for 100 miles in all directions. Those that have gotten that big are reaching 9, 10, 12 million. In 1950, there were only 2 such cities, New York and London. Since that time, 4 more have been added to the 10 million plus, Tokyo, Shanghai, Peking, and Moscow. But by 1985, demographers estimate that 17 of these monster megalopolises will dot the face of the globe. And unfortunately, the lion's share of this urban implosion is not occurring in the industrial West, but in the poverty-stricken third world that can least afford it. The bulk of this urban influx consists of individuals known as squatters or slum dwellers, too. People live in these settlements at the lowest subsistence level, lacking basic services such as access to water, as I said. Garbage, sewage, and all of this disposal is not there. Living accommodation horribly overcrowded. No protection from the elements, surrounded by densely packed microenvironment, which provides a fertile breeding ground for vermin and pestilence of every kind. In terms of sheer physical destructiveness and disease-carrying potential, the rat rates as the #1 enemy of mankind. The lord of the urban underworld, a lover of filth, darkness, and refuse. He is a known vector for 35 different diseases, including bubonic plague, jaundice, typhoid, and trichinosis. The world rat population is put in the neighborhood of 3.5 to 4 billion, almost 1 rat for every human being. India alone is suspected of harboring some 2.4 billion of these ravenous rodents. The United States, by comparison, hosts a modest population of about 100 million. Rats can develop immunity, by the way, to standard poisons, even like arsenic and strychnine, within a few generations. Even warfarin, the pesticide hailed as sure death to rats, is now losing some of its potency and punch. Warfarin was designed to kill rats by preventing their blood from coagulating, but now a generation of immune super rats is spreading in both the United States and Europe. And with them, every step of the way, go germs and parasites. How well is this civilized world prepared to combat this rat invasion? Although various vaccines and antibiotics have been responsible for significant gains in the battle against disease, some of these successes have come at a terrible price. In the late 1960s, bacteriologists discovered that bacteria subjected to drug treatment had the ability to infect their microbial cousins with multiple drug resistance. Researchers found that pathogens of the plague, typhoid fever, cholera, and dysentery were among those that could quickly acquire the resistance factor. As one medical doctor stated, and I quote, "Unless we put a halt to the prodigal use of antibiotics and synthetic drugs, we may soon be forced back into the pre-antibiotic era of medicine." With problems of this magnitude, the potential for massive disease epidemic already lies seething just beneath the surface. The symbolic rider apparently has already mounted the pale horse of the apocalypse. This horseman, the fulfillment of this mysterious biblical prophecy, is going to be the greatest catastrophe ever to confront the human race. In Revelation 6 and verse 8, John writes, and I'm going to quote, "I looked and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death. And hell," the Greek word is Hades, that means the grave, "followed him. And power was given unto them, or over them, to kill the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth." Here is a prophecy that says during the time where we on this earth have 4 billion people and are supposed to double to 8 billion in only 35 more years, there's the potential for 1/4 of all of humanity to die in disease epidemics. And according to the Olivet prophecy, this is only the beginning of sorrows, Matthew 24 and verse 8. And much more is to follow as the world moves into the darkest moments of all of our history. Jeremiah called it the time of Jacob's trouble in Jeremiah 30 and verse 7. And Christ himself said, and I quote, "There will be great tribulation such as was not since the beginning of the world, no, nor ever shall be," meaning a time without parallel, without precedent in the history of the earth. Now, whatever future role disease plays in precipitating these great prophetic events, it's obvious from the prophecies that if there weren't going to be a supernatural intervention from God personally to put a stop to the continually escalating round of war, famine, and disease that will engulf all of this planet, then humanity would not survive. Jesus said in the Olivet prophecy, "For the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." God has promised He will not permit mankind to cross that cosmic fail-safe point into extinction. He is going to intervene. He is going to cut off world events short of that disaster. He said, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved alive, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. How would you like to be one of those elect? Well, through these 4 programs on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, we've illustrated the tragic results of disobedience to living laws, as portrayed by Bible prophecy. But these events, as I've said repeatedly, are conditional. They don't have to happen. God's hand is not short that He cannot prevent it, that He can't save. Prophecies have failed, as the Apostle Paul says, in the past. They can fail in the future. They don't have to happen here. We don't have to suffer the ravages of warfare, of starvation, of disease. Anciently, God instructed the people of newborn nations in individual decisions they could make that would preserve the collective security of their country. He gave us a challenge in Deuteronomy, the 30th chapter, and verse 19, when He said, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you that I have set before you life and death. He says, I set before you blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose. But He doesn't just say choose, take your pick. He says, choose life, will you please? Choose life, that both you and your seed may live. God's law is the way of life, of health, of happiness, of the right way to live. If we individually choose that way of life, then we individually reap the rewards of that way of life. If enough of us collectively will choose that way of life, then the entire nation can be saved. The prophetic warnings are conditional, based upon our own performance. It's up to us one way or the other. We can be saved from these 4 horsemen, and our nation can be saved if we will meet those conditions. If you would do yourself a favor and pick up the telephone and dial that toll-free number I've given you, we can send you all 4 of the booklets all at once on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You can request every one of them. The white horse, which has to do with false Christ and false religion. The red horse, that has to do with warfare. The black horse of famine.